Okay, I don't. What?
I said I'd point at you.
Okay.
I pointed at you.
All right. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. On.
That's really staticky. That mic.
Is this better?
I can't hear you.
Hello. 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 Testing. 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 Testing.
Let me try.
No, Olivia. No, Olivia. Hold on. We got to fix the cable. Try adjusting the cable in the connection.
So we are having some microphone difficulties. Sorry that you were staring directly at Matt's stomach right there. I'm going to turn it around to me. We're having some technical difficulties with our microphone. We're trying to get it working so that it's not pure static. Olivia is very loud in my ear. Hi, Karen.
Hello, testing.
And
Testing, hello.
No, just still static.
It also happens with my school.
That's fun feedback loop.
Testing, testing.
Nope,
Test.
still just static. The other microphone is dead. We're really put together tonight. When do you have to work, Karen? If you're not on, I'm not going to be able to hear you. I have to mute you.
Testing, testing.
Okay, try again.
Testing, testing.
Very static.
Testing, testing.
That mic just does not like.
What to do? We don't have another mic.
I mean, I have it set with a microphone in it. That's all I got.
I'm trying to think. How long is the cord on that?
Look.
The other thing I can do is I can loop you in through your phone and just use the audio from that if you have a microphone that can connect through your phone.
Mama.
This is the fun things we troubleshoot. Why are you giving me things? Yeah, I'm sorry, Karen. I know it was very echo.
Sorry. La la la.
You know, we're just hanging out, trying to get things in between all the other things we have going on. Would I rather? What would I rather?
No, I asked you a question.
I know. I'm waiting for you to ask me the question.
These are tangled.
Yes, you just tangled them.
There we go.
Like, I'd like to pause it, but I don't want to have to cancel and restart. So, just bear with us. We're having lots of fun times here.
Would you rather have a pink
invite.
unicorn or a purple unicorn? Which would you rather have?
I would rather have a purple unicorn.
Here's go.
All right. I got a phone here. Pretty sure this has a microphone in it.
I mean, I really hope it has a microphone in it.
How do I do it?
Okay, I just sent you an email invite. I'm just going to sit here and drink wine and you can enjoy the view. So I know Karen's watching. I know Tim's watching. Who else is watching? When you go to the invite, just turn your camera off. If it lets you.
Like that?
I don't know. You're not in the room yet. Did you hit enter broadcast room? There's your broadcast.
Work.
Let me solo view this one. I don't know. Say something.
Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Testing, testing.
Okay, maybe it's my headphones because I'm still just hearing static. What's everybody else hearing? Can you hear Matt say testing, testing?
Text in the comment section below.
Yeah, go ahead and unplug that. Okay, Karen says you sound great, so let's go with it. And I have to mute my computer now. Okay, so maybe my headphones aren't working. I'm just going to pull that earbud out. I can see you. Can you move? Okay, everybody else is saying you sound fine, so let's go with it.
Okay, so this is cool. This is fine.
Yes, I apparently can't hear him through my headset, so if everybody else can give me a cue if he starts sounding wonky, we will go with this.
Okay, say something, Dara. Say something. You say something. Okay, I muted you on my phone.
Okay,
So
we're not hearing each other.
yeah.
Yes, I know, Evan. You hear Olivia too.
All right, so
The ornament.
um,
Hang on, you're cutting your head off.
it's crushing your head. I'm crushing your head.
And you have no head.
I'm crushing your head.
Now try.
Okay.
Let's
All right.
start over.
So thanks to everyone for this exciting. Okay, Olivia.
6 minutes of.
Okay, thank you, Olivia, for this technical difficulty edition of Professor Matt is Drunk. Right now, I probably have student emails about their term paper, so cheers to that. Thanks as always to our Patreon subscribers, Noam Yiffy, also Karen Lee Duffel and Chris Lee. So thanks to everybody who is on the chat with us. As always, if you pop in, say something, say hello, so we know you're there. If you got a question, chime in. We always like to hear from the audience. Audience participation is part of your grade.
Sadly true.
Yeah. I mean, let me turn this off. What can we say? Well, I thought we would talk about Chinese communism tonight because I just got to pull out your earbud out. It's not going to stay in. I thought we'd talk about Chinese communism tonight because we talked about communism for a while, but we didn't get very far. I don't even remember where we stopped talking about communism. Well, yeah, I mean, it's the point of the show.
I know.
Thank you. Yeah. So thanks. But having said that, I don't remember where we left off, but we didn't really talk much about China, so I thought we would talk about Chinese communism. The obvious way to talk about Chinese communism is through, of course, the infamous figure of its leader, Chairman Mao. So I think we talk a little bit about him. He's a kind of an interesting guy in a weird way. The first thing we're going to talk about, of course, is that in Chinese there are two different ways to transliterate Chinese into English. The first way was developed by two 19th century British dudes. It's called Wade Giles. And in the 20th century, the Chinese developed a way they called pinyin. And Chairman Mao falls right into this because a lot of books and stuff was written about him in the 20th century using the Wade Giles of his name, Mao Zedong. But the Chinese argue, and it's sort of like a nationalistic thing, but also you can rationally argue that they are Chinese people, they know how to spell their own language better than us, so that seems to make sense.
I know how to say my own name.
Right, and like I get that when they say that, they're kind of like, we don't need English people to tell us how to be Chinese, but also like if they say it sounds better, like I agree, it's like they would know. I appreciate that you do know how to say that. So in pinyin, Mao is Mao Zedong, and they say that sounds better. So okay. And the confusing thing for history readers and writers is that a lot of Chinese names that come from the late 19th, early 20th centuries fall into the gap where both of their names are used in sources, and so it just if you look at a book, a lot of authors will just say, I use the one that people know most, I use the one that's like the most common, and I just went with it because it was easier. And so we'll call him Mao. I already get over that. And I usually call him Zedong because it sounds better, right? So Mao was born in 1893 in a little tiny village in Henan province called Shaoshang. And his dad had been an impoverished peasant, but had risen through sort of craftiness and hard work and shrewd dealing, through which generations of Chinese peasants are, of course, justifiably famous, to become quite wealthy. And so when Mao was born, he did okay in school. He himself said that he preferred, rather than reading Confucian classics, he liked to read great Chinese novels. And apparently his two favorite novels were The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is Tang Dynasty era story about the breakup of the Han Dynasty, and the civil war that came through China in the aftermath of the fall of the Han, and also The Bandits of the Water Margin, which is a Ming Dynasty era novel about social outcasts, a group of bandits who kind of like Robin Hood and his band of merry men sort of live in the woods and kind of do all these crazy, get up to all these crazy adventures. Big sort of anthology novel. So Mao actually got married to a young woman early on in his life. His father arranged this marriage, and Mao walked out. He said, "I don't want to marry this woman, and I don't care about her, and I'm not doing it, and I won't be told what to do." And I think he had enough of a horizon expanding education to think of himself as not wanting to spend his life being a rich peasant. And so he was like, "I don't want to do this," right? And so that was that, right? And Mao ended up going to school. He went to school in Shanghai, which is a little bit farther south and east and is a bigger city. And he had begun his education as a teacher. He had decided to become like a school teacher. He's on the dog bed. Fing, Fang, you digging? Okay, okay. And so he began his education as a teacher, but then, like a lot of people, he kind of got swept up in events, right? Like things began to sort of change, right? And the big thing that happened was the Qing dynasty that ran China collapses, right? And so Chinese history is usually organized in dynasties, right? There's a whole bunch of them that go way back to Shang. Who is what? I want you to spell it because Chinese pronunciation. Qing. Qing. Yeah, in Chinese, Q is the English letter Q is rendered as CH. Yeah, sometimes so. No, X is SH. Okay. Yeah. So the current leader of China. You see my point now. The current leader of China is Xi Jinping. Yeah. And his name is rendered XI, okay. And so it's Xi, like the English word she, like she is tall. Right, and Q, CH is Q is under CH. So, for example, the Qing dynasty is where we get the word China, and so that's where that word comes from, right? Most Chinese refer to themselves ethnically as Han, which is itself the name of a dynasty that was coterminous roughly with the Roman Empire in Europe, and so the Han dynasty is actually morally, metaphorically, historically kind of the equivalent of ancient Rome in China. But it's also, again, if you ask a Chinese person their ethnicity, they might say Chinese if they are in a Western country, but if they are in China, they would say Han, which of course is again is a dynasty, right? And so if you wind up the clock to the 1200s, the Mongols invaded and they deposed the existing dynasty that had existed. This is the Jin dynasty and the Song dynasty and whatever. They imposed their own dynasty called the Yuan dynasty, which eventually collapses as well as a peasant rebellion. And famously, the peasant revolts against the Mongols, drives them out, and becomes the emperor, right? And so, having said that, the Chinese have their own dynasty, which they call Ming. Ming means brilliant. And sort of Ming artifacts were renowned for a long period of time in European history as being the epitome of sort of like classy, sort of exotic, the iconic Ming vase, right? There's a whole thing in China called chinoiserie, in France, chinoiserie, where people love Chinese stuff like silks, textiles, like, furniture, lacquerware furniture. They go nuts for it. Well, this is even later. This is like in the 1600s, right? When this stuff is expensive and rare. And so what eventually happens to the Ming dynasty is it gets overthrown by the Qing dynasty. And the Qing dynasty is actually a group of guys who come from what is today northeastern China, extreme northeastern China on the border with Russia and North Korea, and they're called the Manchu. And this is, if you know your history of the world, this is fascinating because there's this long-running fight in the history of the world between basically horse nomads and farmers, right? And eventually, like early on, it's like roughly even, and it's like Bronze Age, and it makes sense. The farmers go out there and grub in the dirt and like produce a bunch of surplus of food, and the barbarians are like, we're not doing that, but I will go over there and smash that guy's face and take his bread because I'm not gonna make it. Right. And so you can look at it as sort of like if you fix a position and defend it, you can get wealth. But on the other hand, it's very hard to defend it against the hordes of guys who want to come take your wealth. Right. Oh, God. And so let me fix this up. So it's OK. Yeah, I don't want the earbud in my ear. I just need it to not fall out. And so that's what she said. And so having said that. You say it's the Manchu? Manchu. Is that like Manchurian? Yes. Okay. That's the region of China. Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm going to be very egocentric here and admit that I don't know a lot about the Chinese dynasty's geography. That's why we're here. And so over the course of history, the sort of the arms race between farmers and horse nomads or nomads sort of comes and goes, right? The big thing that happens, of course, is the farmers develop things like bronze and iron, but then, of course, the horse nomads get it. The horse nomads have horses, which is a huge advantage at first, but then as weapons and armor get heavier, it's not. The big thing comes in the 400s and 500s when the horse nomads get the stirrup. which is, I would argue, one of the most significant inventions in the history of the world because it totally changes the utility of combat on the back of a horse. Right, and so tons of horse nomads go nuts in the centuries after the adoption of the stirrup. The Huns, the Avars, the Kumans, the Pechenegs, the Khazars, all the way up to the Mongols and the Timurids and stuff. And gradually, they sort of, it becomes, the balance power gets tilted in the favor of the horse nomads. A bunch of guys on horses riding around, you just can't beat them, right? Yes. Kind of. I mean, like the Dothraki are sort of obviously a stand-in for these sort of horse nomads because they get these big hordes and they have horses and ride around and wreck stuff. And that's kind of where you're at in terms of like between maybe the years 1000 and 1500 or so, where maybe 1400 or so, where it's very difficult to do anything to stop these guys. I mean, Genghis Khan kills probably 70 million people in Central Asia, and the most fortified, wealthy, and heavily defended cities in Central Asia aren't really able to stop him. They just can't handle his giant armies, right? What changes a little bit after the Manchu conquest is gunpowder. It turns out that gunpowder represents a piece of technology that the farmers and this sort of the civilized societies are capable of making, and it really requires technical expertise to create gunpowder, weapons that use it, and so on. But if you get them, you have a huge advantage. I mean, no amount of guys on horseback is going to be able to handle getting shot in the face with a cannon. Or muskets and stuff, right? And so, and the Manchu represent, you might say, the last kind of gasp of the pre-gunpowder era. They're the last big horse nomads to ever really do anything other than get mowed down by people with guns. And remember, the guns just get better, right? You start with your flintlocks and so on, and you get your matchlocks and you get your muskets. Yeah, but I mean, by the 16 and 1700s, if you think you're coming at me with a horse, I'm going to have a cannon with your face on it. By the 1800s, the British are slaughtering people in the Sudan with bolt-action rifles and machine guns. And that's you're done. And now you have to have guns. You can't feasibly fight against someone who has that level of technology unless you have it yourself, which means basically making your society like theirs to a certain, building cities and like industrial plants and stuff, right? And so the Manchu represent kind of like the end of this, right? And so the Ming dynasty is kind of flailing. It's beset on all sides. There's famine, there's plague. There's a general disaffection of the educated class who think that the government has lost the sort of mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule. There are Japanese pirates. There's a civil war in Japan that spills over into Korea, which sucks in the Chinese who feel obligated to protect their Korean buddies. And there's all this sort of general problem. And on top of it, you have Europeans coming in who sort of add to the mix, right? And so cause their own set of problems as they attempt to exploit things to their advantage. And so it's in this context that the falling apart Ming dynasty is sort of victimized by the Manchus, right? And so the Manchu come from northeastern China. Today it's called Manchuria. It's northeast of Beijing today. Today it's well known as being heavily industrialized, heavily polluted, and it's got a lot of iron and coal in it, which is, you can imagine why that is the case. And so the leader of the Manchu is a guy named Nurhaci. And Nurhaci actually sort of hatches this grand scheme to kind of mobilize the entire Manchu population into this giant army and march them into China. And along the way, he subverts Chinese generals. He points out that he would restore order into the four corners of heaven, and he's a good guy, and aren't the Ming bad? And the horrible thing that happens that is really the sort of apocalyptic event for a lot of Ming educated people is that the Manchu cross the frontier and they get met with a giant army of Ming soldiers who actually goes rogue and joins the Manchu, right? I mean, the Ming generals say, we've no loyalty to the emperor who treats us so callously, and as a consequence, we're just going to back you. We think that you're a good idea. And so Nurhaci dies, and it's his son and grandson who actually live to see the takeover of China by these nomads, right? Who actually lived to see it happen. And so I want to say it's Hung Taiji, I think, was Nurhaci's son, and his son was the Kangxi emperor, who was the first actual Manchu emperor of Japan. It was the guy or China, the first guy to rule as emperor. And we know a lot about Emperor Kangxi because he wrote an autobiography, which is really cool for someone in this early 1600s. And so what else did the Manchu do? Well, I mean, they definitively ruled over China, by one of the things they did to sort of mark it is they ordered all Chinese men to shave the front half of their head and wear their hair in a long braid. And for, a lot of time in Western culture in particular, it was just assumed that's what Chinese people did with their hair. And so all depictions of Chinese people, particularly like Westerns or 19th century depictions of them in the American West, depict them in that way because that was the way they were ordered to do so under pain of death. Cutting your hair off was a political act. I mean, if you cut your hair, you were committing a crime, right? And if you left China and cut your hair off, when you try to come back, they would be like, gee, you look old enough to have a braid. Where's your braid? It's called a queue. Where's your queue? This was intended to signify the difference between Manchu rulers and Chinese subjects, right? And so the Manchu otherwise attempted to make themselves as sort of in a way as Chinese as possible. They adopted Chinese language. They allowed Manchurian to basically go away, and they sort of wanted to rule over China as Chinese people, right? And like ancient Egypt, a lot of foreigners have come to China and ruled it, only to discover that they basically ended up Chinese, right? I mean, you marry a Chinese woman, you have a bunch of kids with her. They're basically Chinese. They speak Chinese. You speak Chinese. You dress Chinese. You eat Chinese food. You worship Chinese religion. And after a generation, it's like who really took over who, you know? And so the Qing dynasty, the Manchus, ruled until the early 20th century. But it was not an easy thing. Yeah.
Karen asked, was it one of those autobiographies that are like, oh, and then I slew my enemy with
No, he's
with my life?
No, he's actually somewhat introspective, and writes about the sort of job of ruling China, which is one of the more authentic portraits of being a Chinese emperor. And of course, Chinese emperor would never slay anything. I mean, he doesn't like touching things and getting your hands calloused and actually executing tasks is for underlings. I mean, you're the son of heaven. So yeah, you just sit in your yellow robe and your little square Chinese emperor hat, and you receive reports from people, and you write them and stamp them, and you give them back. And you don't like do like killing people is for soldiers. You pay people to do that. I mean, it's like, you know. But yeah, and actually, he has a manservant who apparently lived with him for a while, named Hu, and then who like immigrated to France and lived in France in like the 1600s. And so Jonathan Spence is a scholar at like Cambridge, I think, who wrote extensively about this period of Chinese history and wrote a number of books about Emperor Kangxi and Hu and all this stuff. And his books are quite good, and they're based on the sort of the documentation that Kangxi left behind, but also this sort of epical transformation in Chinese life. Right, and within a couple decades, the Manchu have actually hunted down and killed the last Ming in Vietnam. They actually crossed the border into Vietnam, and they executed the last remaining Ming Dynasty princes, relatives, and stuff. So the dynasty was over. And so, having said that, this is the dynasty that Mao and all other Chinese people in the early 20th century grew up in, but it was kind of falling apart. They had had a rough time in the 19th century. In the 1840s, the British took over Hong Kong, and began to aggressively push Indian-produced opium into southern China, which was humiliating and, of course, terrifying. And when the Chinese reacted harshly against this, the British ended up launching an invasion of China, which they won, and the Opium War, it was called. And they won the right to deal drugs to Chinese people. The Chinese government was essentially told they could not interfere with British East India Company activities in. Corey's looking like she's having a problem. You need a bottle opener? Yeah. Go to the refrigerator next. The shark is next to the fridge.
Since you paused.
What you want wine?
I want the wine bottle, or give me wine, or. That's fine. That's fine. I don't need to be drunk. You need to be drunk. I don't need to be drunk. Somebody's got to finish making dinner.
Fing. Oh, he's sleeping. Fing, Gran Fing. He'll when he hears people, he'll be back.
He's gonna growl at you.
He'll be grumpy. It's exciting to watch.
No, I'm not gonna touch him. He's gonna get mad.
Well, he'll just when you pet him, Fing, Fing puppy. He's awake now. Fing, for Fing to come. He's coming. All right. So, having said that, go around, Fang. Go around. Okay. It was just exciting drama.
Okay, so China.
So the Opium Wars marked a period the Chinese refer to as the century of humiliation. This is this 100-year-long period where China basically gets carved up and kind of disposed of by European powers. You want me to pick up Fang and put him in so everyone can see Fang?
Sure.
Okay, hold on. Fang, we'll make. Come here. Fang. Come here.
I did that.
Come here. Oh, come here. It's a Fang. It's a Fang. Fang.
No face.
Fang's like, just I want to stick my tongue in your mouth. Okay, so the Chinese refer to this period as the century of humiliation. It's this time when the Europeans basically take over China, and the Chinese feel sort of helpless and kind of unable to. They can't even assert their country's sovereignty. I mean, they're an ancient civilization that goes back to the Bronze Age. They produce some of the greatest, works of literature, culture, art, science, whatever. And European barbarians are basically are pushing them around, and there's nothing they can do. The British even win the right under the Treaty of Nanjing that ends the Opium War to actually get their own citizens extraterritorial status in China, which is to say that if a British citizen is accused of committing a crime in China, he will be tried in a British court according to British laws in Britain, which basically gives British citizens kind of like criminal immunity in China, which is humiliating. And I know that if you talk to Xi Jinping today, he would say, as all Chinese leaders have said for generations, that their goal is to never allow China to be treated that way again. They have this very prickly nationalism about it, right? So what can we say? Well, at the dawn of the 20th century, the Chinese emperor is technically an empress. Her name is Qixi, right? And she is actually a concubine who outlasted her husband and her son and I think her grandson. And the current heir apparent to the throne is a young man named Puyi. And so it's quite clear that this is not going to last forever because there are increasing demands in China to replace the emperor with something more effective and responsive. And the two sort of poles of this are effective, meaning we want a government that will actually protect us. Like the Chinese people want a government that will actually function effectively and not kind of manage China's collapse, but rather like reassert China's independence and power against Europeans. And they want a government that is more responsive. The Chinese have a great deal of experience with the outside world. They look at what's going on in other countries. They look at the modernization of Japan. They look at Europeans and they say, there's no reason why we can't have a government like that. And the father, you might say, of Chinese independence is a doctor, actually, a Chinese convert to Christianity who's educated in Colorado at an American university. I want to say it was University of Boulder. And his name was Sun Yat-sen. And Sun Yat-sen forcibly argued the Chinese deserve democracy, right? And so in 1912, the Chinese empire was overthrown. And this is something that sort of, again, Mao is like trying to live his life. And, the world has ideas, right? And so, having said that, the Chinese empire kind of comes crashing down. Right, World War I happens, and the Japanese use this opportunity to begin grabbing chunks of China for themselves, particularly because A, nobody's really paying attention to what the Japanese are doing, and B, because the Japanese use the League of Nations as an excuse to sort of mop up. They sort of appeal to it as to protect the European colonies that have lost World War I. We'll get there. The European countries lost World War I, will get their colonies. Right, the Germans had a bunch of concessions on the Shantung Peninsula, and the Japanese sort of were like, we'll take those. We'll run those for the for now. Right. By the way, if you like weird beer, there's a Chinese beer called Tsingtao, which is pretty good. And Tsingtao was produced. It's Chinese beer. Like you got to go to Total Wine and go to the import beer aisle. Beer, but not weird. All right, whatever words. You like it. You don't like weird beer. By some people's definitions. You want peanut butter and jelly beer? No. Exactly. That doesn't sound remotely good. It's not weird. It's bad. So, hard pass. Yeah. So you don't like weird beer. You like cool. So when we're done arguing semantics, I mean, I've been married to you for long enough to know that you will never be done arguing semantics. Karen agrees that it's not weird. Indeed, Fang is just happy that Corey is here to pet him. Which is not always the case. So no. Fang. Wait, just job one. He's taking care of. Oh, okay. All right. So anyway, the Chinese actually took over the German brewery that made German beer for the German people that lived in the town, and then that's where they ended up exporting it to make money at Tsingtao. And so Port Arthur was I don't think it was in Port Arthur. No, Port Arthur is one of the towns on the Shantung Peninsula that the Japanese had fought the Russians for control of in the Russo-Japanese War that ended with the Battle of Tsushima. By the way, who settled the war and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize? Republican American President Theodore Roosevelt settled the Treaty of Portsmouth. Yeah, we do love Theodore Roosevelt. And so, in any case, the collapsing Chinese empire generated these sort of huge calls for, like we want democracy, right? There was the May 4th movement that broke out, I want to say in like 1919, of students and intellectuals pushing for democracy in China. And Mao at this time kind of had moved around, still working on his plans to, maybe be a teacher. But as again, events had kind of were sweeping away, right? And I want to say it's 1921. It's in one of the foreign cantonments in Shanghai that they founded the Chinese Communist Party. And Mao was initially not interested in communism. He was interested more in democracy and other things, but he gradually got attracted to it throughout the course of the 20s. Right. And what ended up happening in the 20s in China and in the 30s was a period that's often referred to as the warlord period, where the Chinese imperial dynasty had collapsed. And there was no real government to replace it. There was no central government, and former generals, gangsters, political figures basically carved up pieces of China for themselves, and basically took over pieces of China and fought amongst each other for control of the economy, trade routes, import-export controls with Europeans, and the violence in China was pretty bad, and it began a sort of a serious period of civil war in China that lasted until the end of World War II, till after the end of World War II. And so at the same time, we have the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. We also have to talk about the descendant party of Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Yes. I mean, kind of. Yeah. I mean, not a more realistic version of libertarianism than anything libertarians have offered in fiction or their own ideas. And it was essentially total anarchy. I mean, it was essentially the sort of dystopian, and nobody really, I mean, everybody's making money, so nobody really had an incentive. I mean, nobody's going to like send troops in to go stop the Chinese Civil War, because if you're like France or something, you're like, we don't have an army to do this. The League of Nations can't get together and get its act together to do anything about it. And so, at the same time as the CCP is beginning to agitate for two things: the restoration of Chinese sovereignty, but also social, and political, and economic reforms to empower the lower classes, Sun Yat-sen's party sort of collapses, but is replaced by a successor called two different things depending on how you transliterate it. It's sometimes called the Kuomintang. It's also called the Kuomintang. Koumingtang, Kuomintang, and it's often abbreviated as KMT. Right, its symbol's a blue circle with a white flower and white petals on it. And this party was initially headed by Sun Yat-sen, and later passes under the control of a very wily, charismatic guy named Chiang Kai-shek. Right, and his name is often rendered in the White Giles rather, and so it's Chiang and then Kai and then Shek. If you render it the other way, it's Zhang Jishe, which nobody really knows him by. If you look up books about that, you're not going to find many books about that in English. He's usually known as Chiang Kai-shek. He was very famous in America, and most people in America who knew him used that name, right? And so Chiang Kai-shek ends up the leader of the KMT, and he actually marries a very, very interesting wife. There are three sisters. They come from the Sung family. Right, their dad was TV Sung, a very famous banker and ally of Chiang Kai-shek, a businessman from Shanghai. And there are three sisters. There's Sung Mailing, Sung Ailing, and Sung Qingling. And Sung Ailing married Sun Yat-sen, and Sung Mailing married Chiang Kai-shek. Right, and the third one, Sung Qingling, actually became a communist. Was very, very, very famous during the mid part of the 20th century. As you can imagine, the communists were quick to sort of trot her out for kind of street cred, because she was, one of the Sung sisters. So there was, I have a book about him called Big Sister, Little Sister, Red Sister. And so Sung Mailing was a very, very smart, very crafty woman. She was educated at Wellesley College in America, and she kept up. I mean, she like routinely would send letters to her classmates and go to reunions and stuff, even when she became very famous and wealthy. During the 30s, she became quite friendly with Eleanor Roosevelt, and Franklin Roosevelt stayed at the White House a number of times. Franklin Roosevelt remarked, of course, that when she stayed at the White House, she brought her own sheets. Because their accommodations were apparently not up to snuff, and so she produced her own silk sheets that she had on the bed. Oh, not since the Franklin Theodore Roosevelt days. So I mean, it was a little. I mean, the sheets are clean. Yeah, probably they have washing machine. Certainly not as high as the like handcrafted silk sheets that she brought from China. So, and one of the things that her name is often called Madame Chiang Kai-shek. One of the things that Madame Chiang Kai-shek did is that she kind of uh, she sort of viewed her job as to kind of cement an alliance between the KMT and America. And the KMT became the sort of repository for many Americans of the idea that China was going to be a democracy, wanted to be a democracy. Chinese people wanted American style democracy, constitution, voting rights, and this kind of stuff. And the KMT was going to be the way that happened, right? The party cared about China in this way. And you got to understand, it seems weird because we grew up in a time when news about China was pretty rare when I was a kid. I mean, there wasn't a lot of information about China, but in the early 20th century, there were huge American and foreign presences in China. There was extensive Christian missionary work in China. Every Christian church was sending stuff over to China, money and missionaries and stuff. The Henry Luce, the founder of Time and Life magazines, was educated in China as a young boy, was actually the son of missionaries from China. So, I mean, as you can imagine, Time and Life paid a lot of attention to China. And so there were tons of writing and all kinds of culture about China in America. And so, a lot of people thought that like this was the up and up, right? And so during the 30s, the civil war in China intensified. And increasingly what Chiang Kai-shek did is co-opt, buy off, bribe, or sort of assimilate the warlords in a lot of China. And in northern China, he basically took over control of the country. And the Communist Party, at this point, Mao is a pretty big wheel in the Communist Party, having risen through the ranks, really controlled southern and central China, right? And so what happened in the early 30s is that Chiang Kai-shek decides that now that he's kind of got his backfield clear and the Kuomintang is kind of running northern China, he's going to invade southern China and defeat the Kuomintang. Defeat the Communist Party. And he does. He invades. They drive the communists out of their hideouts. They crush them. They bomb them with, of course, all kinds of weapons that they've gotten. And what the communists do is they pack everything up and they march south and then west and then north and then east, like a couple thousand miles, all the way to a very, very rural, desolate part of western China called Hainan, not to be confused with Hunan, which is the province that Mao was originally from.
And she was pronounced southern again.
I did pronounce it wrong. I did say southern. So it was a portmanteau of south and southern.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Karen. Yes. It's interesting to note, of course, that the word south and the word southern pronounce the O differently, which is what I did wrong.
You don't have to explain this to me. I'm teaching a kindergartner how to write.
Well, we do need to explain it to Karen because she did notice and demanded that it be intended to.
This morning trying to explain the word peace.
How about the word correct? Correct.
Okay.
Carrot, chocolate.
Peace, at least for the hard thing, because she's like, it's pies.
That's I mean, it does have a diphthong, and those are hard.
Karen says it's okay. She likes how you say it.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Katie. No, I'm talking about Katie, who totally messaged me on Instagram making fun of me as well. Thanks, Katie. Cheers to you. So. Yeah, I'm getting lit up. I'm getting it on Instagram and in the Facebook comments. That's cool.
She's not even giving us the like because she's watching him talk.
That's true. Is he in the comments too? Yeah, because you've been yeah. She's separately subtexting me on the side here to let me know that I'm saying things wrong. Appreciate it. So what is this note from Amazon? Oh, cool. Thanks, Amazon. I'm super glad the package that was lost that I went through a bunch of rigmarole to get a refund for was delivered tonight. So thanks.
Where?
Yeah, it's at the front door. You're not allowed to go look at it because it's probably in a box with the contents of it labeled on the freaking side.
So my mom wants to know if we're supposed to make fun of him. You always make fun of him.
When does that stop anybody? So having said that, this whole thing where the communists escape to the west in Hainan is called the Long March. And it becomes the sort of foundation myth of the Chinese Communist Party. It's sort of retold in novels and stories and plays and songs and movies and all of this heroism with the KMT flying in planes and bombers and everybody kind of marching away stoically and abandoning everything on the west side of the road and leaving behind comrades who were wounded and all this stuff. Mao himself, by the way, has a girlfriend and a wife. The wife is pregnant, gives birth, and he tells her, you can't take a nursing infant on the...
Sorry, Hawk said actually she's not here. She just went out of her way
Oh, okay, cool. Thanks, Katie. Cheers. And so Mao actually has a wife who is pregnant, and when she gives birth, he tells her you can't take a little baby on the thing, and so she gives the baby to peasants who just take it, who just raise the baby. And so somewhere in China, Mao had a kid that he never knew anything about. And
I mean, he knew about it.
well, he never knew what their name was or where they ended up living, or I mean, he knew the extent of Mao's knowledge was that he knew the child existed, but he knew nothing other than that. So he wouldn't have been. It's not like he knew where the kid was and could have gone at any time. It was like he deliberately abandoned the infant. It's like a 2-day-old infant, and then kept marching. And so there's a lot of mythology about the Long March, and you have to really pay attention to the communist. Go ahead.
No, Karen said she was so caught up in making fun of you that she forgot to go clock in at the earliest time she could.
Okay. All right. Well, that's the wages of sin.
Sorry, Karen. Go do your nursing job.
Yeah, that's the wages of sin, Karen. That's what you get taking pot shots. Yeah. I mean, I don't remember. Karen's is labor and delivery. So yeah.
An even bigger.
We do have a friend up in Virginia who is Virginia. It's Kristen Yakuza. Yeah, she's a COVID nurse. Actually, COVID nurse. It's Virginia.
Okay.
So it's Virginia. Yeah.
They don't watch, so.
Yeah, but she's actually COVID nurse. Karen is labor and delivery. So it's like, thank God she doesn't have to do COVID.
Are you just saying she's not?
No, I'm saying her job is not like, she's not a COVID nurse, which is awful.
Yeah.
So
her job is hard.
Yeah, her job is hard. I mean, being a nurse is hard. It's not easy nursing jobs, but.
I yelled at my well, I mean, that's a good night here because you had successful laborers. Well, yes, and I mean, I just didn't want anyone seeing anything. Yeah, but Karen has definitely very firm about a few bad nights that she.
Oh yeah, no, yeah. No, and ours was fine except for the fire alarm going off.
Yeah, she says she gotta go do the baby thing. I'm so glad I'm not a COVID nurse.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Love you, Karen.
Bye, Karen. Yeah, and you can turn it. You can adjust the tree. Yeah. So anyway, what can we say? Well, Mao kind of sets up shop in Hainan, and the communists. It's all they're in this hilly section of China, which is all low S. It's all windblown dirt from eastern China. Blown out from the actually, I guess from northern and western China. It's all windblown silt. And they dig caves out of the side of the hillsides, and a parade of admiring journalists come out there in the 30s to write books about the sort of brave band of heroes that have fought all the way to Western China. And the most famous is Edgar Snow, who writes a book called Red Star Over China, where he basically goes and gives Mao like a handy, and writes this book about like how great Mao is. And you're not familiar with that one?
Not in that context, no.
Boom. And so he goes and he writes this incredibly admiring profile of how brave and resourceful they are trying to build a new China and whatever. And of course, it's all sort of spoon-fed propaganda. I mean, like Mao, obviously they sit everyone down and like, all right, the Americans coming out here, so we're going to clean this shit up, get rid of the prisoners, get them out of here. Anybody have a problem, we're going to shoot them first. Okay, good. And then Snow comes in and gets this, perfectly Potemkin village, sort of ideal of what communism is like in Western China, which is, again, it's a show, right? I mean, the fact that Mao abandoned people, the fact that he rules the Communist Party with an increasing iron fist, which is he's used the Long March to solidify his control over the party, all that stuff is kind of just, not present in Snow's works. And it was widely read by Americans just because it was interesting. I mean, this is an interview with a guy who was living in the edge of the universe, right? I mean, it had gone to the far western reaches of China after sort of losing the battle against the KMT. What is going on?
Like he coughed. I'm out of here.
Oh, okay, yeah.
No coughing is.
Yeah, that's right.
He wasn't down that this past weekend.
You didn't run.
Dude hasn't left the house. He doesn't leave the house. His Google maps.
No.
He's like, oh, here's your summary from this last week. You went to Publix twice.
Yeah, like Life 360 is like, oh, Matt Giddings at the Giddings has been there since Monday at 8 a.m. And so having said that, what can we say? Well, why does Chiang Kai-shek not come in and sort of drop the hammer? Why does he not finish these guys off? Well, the answer is really simple. The Japanese, right? The Japanese have decided to exploit the weakness of China for their own gain. They invade northern China and they seize chunks of northeastern China. Particularly, they seize Manchuria, and they set up a kingdom in Manchuria called Manchukuo. and they put in charge of it Puyi, right? The descendant of the last empress of China, himself the last emperor, right? And so it's a great, of course, he wrote an autobiography, The Last Emperor, and Bernardo Bertolucci made it into, of course, a famous movie, The Last Emperor. It's like a 4 hour long.
Apparently really
It's a good movie. It's a good movie. I want to watch. I want to watch it
last
again.
week you went on about it.
It's a good movie, right? Much better, compared favorably by many reviewers to The Empire of the Sun, which is itself a pretty good movie, but is a sort of a navel gazing kind of myopic movie. It's a movie about a white guy in China during the most important events in Chinese history, and so it's kind of like you couldn't write a
Because
movie
you
about
can't
some
care about
Chinese
anything
dudes. Exactly. And by the way, major breakout performance by an extremely young Christian Bale, and a 1 second performance by Ben Stiller, which gave him the idea for Tropic Thunder, because Christian Bale eventually ends up in a POW camp during the Japanese War, and there's a scene where there's like 1 or 2 scenes featuring an American POW who's like a bomber pilot or something. It's Ben Stiller.
That shit is after DC there.
No, I think it was before Newsies because I think he was really young. He was like really, really young. It was either right before or right after because he's a little kid. Look it up. And so anyway, the Japanese seize chunks of northern China, and Chiang Kai-shek essentially spends his time, fighting these guys. And this prevents Chiang Kai-shek with this sort of insoluble dilemma. Do you go after the Japanese, who are seriously threatening the integrity of China, or do you go after the communists who want to take over the country from you? Chiang Kai-shek spends most of his time fighting the communists. He does only enough Japanese fighting as he needs to do. And famously, he says the Japanese are a disease of the skin, but the communists are a disease of the heart, right? They're going to kill us. And his thinking is that if he can defeat the communists, of course he can turn around and fight like no Chinese person would not want to defeat the Japanese. That's not the real problem.
I guarantee you, it was a full 4 years before he did Newsies. Almost 5 years. Mic drop. Yeah, I'll give you that, dear. Remember, you haven't eaten dinner yet.
Everything's fine.
I'm not planning to vomit tonight. I got too much to do tomorrow.
I mean, I didn't vomit the night I had like a bottle and a half. I'm probably gonna be fine.
I kind of wish you had.
Everything was fine.
When did you drink a bottle and a half?
It's like the first time we did it.
You also drank a whole.
Yeah, I seem to remember somebody else drinking a lot too.
And I felt a lot better.
Yeah. So anyway, what can we say about the Civil War? Well, I mean, it rages kind of on, and the Japanese attack into China, and then a couple years later, 1937, they do the same thing. They escalate it. There's a famous incident at Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing, which is allegedly where Marco Polo entered the city in the 1200s. And in fact, what the Japanese provoke some Chinese guys into attacking them, and then they counterattack, and then they get counterattacked. And what the Japanese military does is it uses this as an excuse to sort of drag Japan into the war. But the generals go to the government and they say, hey, are you just going to let the Chinese kill Japanese soldiers? Do you not give a shit about these brave men that died? And of course, the Japanese government's like, look, we don't want to go to war in China. And the Japanese government's like, oh, so you're cowards. We get it, And so the military basically drags the Japanese government into a renewed offensive in China. And this puts Japan on a collision course with the United States of America. The Americans are deeply sympathetic to the KMT. They are not quite aware, as we are now, of the horrible corruption and mendacity of most KMT officials. And it is viewed by everybody as A, not communist, and B, better than the alternative for China. So it's our man, right? And as you remember, Chiang Kai-shek has good PR in Washington because his wife's friends with Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, right? And so the Japanese attack Beijing. They capture it. Chiang Kai-shek's army flees to the south. He blows up the dikes on the Yellow River and floods most of northern China while he gets away to cover his escape. And he gets to Shanghai. The Japanese bomb Shanghai. They bomb the shit out of it, which is horrifying. The KMT flees up the river to Nanking. The Japanese bomb Nanking. When the KMT flees, the Japanese take the city and murder 300,000 people. No, Peking is Beijing. Peking and Beijing are different translations of it. Also, for a time in the 1920s, the capital of China is Nanking, so they refer to Beijing. Beijing means northern capital, and so they changed the name of Beijing to Northern City, which means it's Beiping, but nobody calls it that because that's stupid. Kind of, yeah. And so Beijing and Peking are the same city, and variously Chang'an, Xi'an, and Nanking and Beijing have all been capitals depending on the dynasty. Although there's a point at which it's just Beijing after like 1200 or something like that. And so Nanking actually and Beijing means northern capital, Nanking means southern capital. And so it's different dynasties use them. on the Yellow River, Nanking on the Yangtze River, two rivers that run west to east from Central Asia to the Pacific Ocean. And so when Chiang Kai-shek's men flee up the river to Nanking, they retreat again, and the Japanese butcher about 350,000 people in the city when they take it. The rape of Nanking, which is pretty well documented, although the Japanese government denies it to this day. They deny that it ever happened, despite there being like pictures and film and testimony and all that shit. What's that? Yeah, well, and the Japanese actually, or the Chinese rather, built a giant museum to it to sort of deliberately sort of poke the Japanese in the eye. And the stupid Japanese, to this day, it would be great to unite all of East Asia in an anti-Chinese alliance. Right? We get our buddies, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Filipinos, the Vietnamese, the Australians, the Indonesians, and we can all sit around a table and be like, everybody here may not like everyone else, but let's all agree we're really freaked the fuck out by China. But of course, no one will want to sit at the table with the Japanese because everybody got butchered by the Japanese in World War II, and the Japanese won't fucking admit it, right? Even today, like they were like, well,
But they still don't even really admit that they use Australians for prostitutes.
No, and it's like there's like living people that remembered that. My favorite story, by the way, is that in Seoul there's a park across from the Japanese embassy with a statue of a sex slave, a Korean woman who's a sex slave, a comfort woman is the Japanese euphemism. And the South Korean government want to be nice to the Japanese, so they're going to bulldoze the park and replace it. And people chained themselves to the statue. And they were like, don't do it. And a billionaire, like some tech guy, who's like some super rich tech guy in South Korea, he bought the land next to the park. He made an absolute replica of the park down to the last like leaf on a bush and erected the same statue, but like a little bigger. And then he put a plaque on it that was like, this park will always be free and open to the public, and I will never sell it to the South Korean government under any circumstances. So the Japanese like can't get rid of the park. They can't get rid of the statue of the comfort woman, like accusingly looking at the Japanese embassy, which is hilarious. It's like if you have billions of dollars, that's kind of shit you should do, right?
I don't know. I'm pretty big fan of supplying vaccines to third world countries for free.
Well, I mean, it's like the Dolly Parton thing where every time something cool happens.
Oh my god! Like every time I look into her, she's done another.
Yeah, she's all like, "Well, I do this
without any fanfare."
Yeah, I do this thing where I send kids books or I whatever, and it's like that's like you really wonder about like Jeff Bezos. It's like I get that he wants to send people in rockets and whatever, but like at the end of the day, you got like $50 billion. Why aren't you building? Why aren't you like building jetpacks or building like a castle on the moon or something? I mean, like why? What does he do?
I mean, we all can't be Elon Musk
launching cars into space, and Jack Dorsey apparently kills animals with lasers and then cooks their food and serves them to people at his home. And it's like, that's cool, except it's actually really stupid. And you should if you're the head of Twitter, you should have better things to do with your spare time than that. Like you should be, I don't know, like rocket powered exoskeletons for you, or, I don't know, Terminators or something. And so anyway, what ends up happening is that the American government increasingly sanctions the Japanese government over its conduct in China. And this is what leads to the war between Japan and America. The Japanese eventually decide to seize control of Southeast Asia. They decide to seize control of the Philippines, Indochina, Indonesia, and so on. They call it the Southern Resource Area. And in so doing, they decide that they've got to defeat the Americans. And the reason they need to seize these resources is because of the American sanctions. The sanctions lead to them deciding to go to war. And before they can seize Southeast Asia, they need to eliminate the American Navy, hence Pearl Harbor, right? And so the Civil War in China grinds on relentlessly. It's sort of subsumed by the Japanese War, the Pacific War. And we supply Chiang Kai-shek extensively during the war. In the early part of the war, when the war has not been declared, famously, Claire Chennault was the American pilot who leads a squadron of unofficial guys, the Flying Tigers, that go over and fly combat missions in support of the KMT soldiers. His wife is later going to become infamous because alongside Anna Chennault, Richard Nixon arguably committed treason to get elected in 1968, intervening in the negotiations that would end the Vietnam War. And he used Anna Chennault, Claire Chennault's wife, as a cutout. And so Chiang Kai-shek himself and his family went up the river from Nanking up the Yangtze to Chongqing or Chunqing, a city that is up the river. And so from
the phrase up the river?
I have no idea. I think up the river comes from Sing Sing, because Ossining is up the river from New York State or New York City.
I didn't hear what you said. Sorry.
So anyway.
Say it again.
I feel like that Sing Sing thing was a Jeopardy question.
Maybe, because it's Ossining is the city where Sing Sing is located. And so, okay.
I mean, mean, you're lecturing.
Oh, sorry,
we're
just
all
like
looking at you
just
because
give
you're
some-
lecturing.
So, in any case, we supplied Chiang Kai-shek extensively with Lend-Lease aid during the war. Famously, they did two things to get him supplies. In the beginning, there was no way to get him stuff by road, so they flew stuff over the Himalayas, and they called it going over the hump. And when you fly C-47s over the hump, you actually flew through the Himalaya. You didn't fly over the mountains, and you're like, oh, you actually flew through the valleys because the mountains were too high. And it was incredibly dangerous. But I mean, plane load of stuff at the time, food, medical supplies, ammunition, whatever. And then eventually we built a road. Yeah. And eventually we built a road they called the CBI, the China Burnham India Road. And the road, at some points, the road was it's like San Francisco, where they switched back, it was like 37 hairpin turns to go up a hill. And that was aided greatly by, the opening of that road was aided greatly by the British conquest of Malaysia back from the Japanese. Shout out to the British General Slim. General Slim, who was the guy that led the conquest of Burma, one of the more significant military campaigns in the Pacific War. And so when the war ended in 1945, the Japanese were defeated utterly. And interestingly, millions of their soldiers were still in China that had to be rounded up and sent home. The Chinese had to round up these Japanese soldiers and tell them, okay, nuclear bombs, you lost, go home. And they did. But it took time. And of course, between the communists and the KMT, there was an intense jockeying for position at the end of the war, right? I mean, it was all about seizing strategically significant territory that you would then expel the Japanese from and take their weapons, because you were immediately going to begin fighting the other side as soon as the Japanese were out. And the Civil War picks, right back up. I mean, it's like, covering a fire and then lifting it up, and it just blazes right up. And we immediately began supporting the KMT, right? The Truman administration, circa 1945, immediately began supporting the KMT. And John Marshall, the Secretary of State, goes over to China. And I'm sorry, George Marshall, because John Marshall is the Supreme Court Justice. George Marshall goes over to sort of lead this effort to save China from the communists, right? And to make a long story short, the communists were better organized. They had a better position with the populace. They had more Japanese weapons. They had support from Russia, which had waffled. The Russians had supported the communists and then the KMT because they thought they were probably better. And then the communists, but then the KMT because they didn't want to piss off the Americans. And so they were very sort of ambivalent, but eventually they backed Mao. And so to make a long story short, 1949, Chiang Kai-shek is driven out of Beijing. And there's this October 1st, 1949, the Chinese Communist Party enters the capital. Mao goes to Tiananmen Square, which is the Square of Heavenly Peace, big square in front of the Forbidden City. He climbs the Moon Gate on top of the Moon Gate. It's a gate of heavenly peace that leads to the Forbidden City. And he proclaims the formation of the People's Republic of China, the Communist Government of China. And everybody's wondering, this is always the question we have, is Mao an Asian Tito? Tito, remember, is
the fourth time you brought up Tito.
It's important to bring up Tito. He's the only communist leader in Europe other than Enver Hoxha in Albania, of his own free will, rather than being imposed by the victorious Red Army, right? And so having said that, Mao immediately answers this question, right? Immediately. He says, the Chinese Communist Party must form a united front with all workers and the popular masses and the proletariat and all working countries. We must lean to one side. And so everybody's like, well, there's your question, right? And Mao actually, the first thing he does is go to the Soviet Union and ask for aid, military, financial, economic aid. The first thing Mao asked for, by the way, is the Russians just set off a nuke in September. And so the first thing Mao says is, can we have the nuke? And the Russians are like, fuck you. And Stalin privately says, we're not going to give the
You're
night.
sitting here. You could just say these things.
No, because they're stupid comments.
And so
Stupid comment. We make stupid comments all the time.
I made fun of a bunch.
About fame.
Yeah.
Only if it's a short answer.
Yeah.
What's the Forbidden City?
The Forbidden City is a multi square mile, I think.
The Emperor's private city, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a
You missed the part about Handy that apparently Corey was really.
I heard Handy. He's like, what?
It's the Emperor. It's where the Emperor lives, but it's also where his private household is, and they manage. It's basically like the White House, where it's the personal residence, but also where all the official government business. Yeah, it's like a couple of miles square. It's huge. And
an imperial city.
the crucial thing you have to understand about the Chinese emperors too is that in absolutist France in the 1600s, was an intensely public figure, right? The king was everything the king did, from waking up in the morning to going to bed at night, eating, dressing, all of that stuff is intensely public, right? The Chinese emperor instead was the opposite. Everything was totally secluded. Ordinary people were not allowed to witness the Chinese emperor forbid, yeah, because you're just a schlub. We're just slub. He's the emperor, right? He's the son, and so the Chinese emperor maintained that sort of mystique in seclusion, right? And again, as you say, it's forbidden, right? Today, you can actually visit the Forbidden City. It's a tourist attraction. The Chinese communists immediately opened it up, partly to sort of be like everyone should see this because it's cool, but also like look what isn't this a justification for communism if there ever was one, right? Like you live in a shack and the emperor lived in this. I mean, am I right? And actually, when they filmed The Last Emperor, they allowed Bertolucci to film it in the Forbidden City. They actually they allowed him in, and they allowed him to dress it and clean it up and stuff, and they filmed a bunch of scenes there. Very similar to Marie Antoinette being allowed to film in Versailles. Absolutely, yeah. And so, having said that, again, Mao asked Stalin for the nukes, and Stalin was like, like A, we just got them, so like, and B, we would never give those to you. And so, the Chinese actually embark on their own nuclear weapons project. It costs like $1 gajillion. They do it all their own, and they get it in the '60s. And they're sort of very proud about like their nuclear power, and they didn't get them from someone, and they built it themselves, right? And so, when Mao takes over China, what happens, right? Well, there's a few things we got to mention. The first is an intense land reform campaign. And Mao uses this land reform campaign, on the one hand, to take land from the wealthy peasants and the landlords and give it to the ordinary people, which is kind of what they promised to do, right? But Mao also uses it as a way to solidify control over China, right? By empowering poor peasants and allowing them to take revenge on rich peasants, Mao essentially brings them into the party and extends the control of the party. The land reform campaign is carried out at the local level by the locals working with the Communist Party, which kind of sinks the tentacles of the Communist Party through into the entire country, right? There's famously an American sociologist who lived in a village called Fanshen, which means longbow, in China, Edgar Hinton. And Hinton was suffered terribly as a result of various purges, thanks to McCarthyism and whatever. But he wrote a really good book about the experience of land reform in this city in China, in this little tiny village in China. And so that allowed Mao to sort of, really shake up China. As a consequence, the same thing that's happened anywhere that this has ever been done: Zimbabwe, Kenya, Russia after the communist takeover, it absolutely crashed agricultural production. I mean, it just destroyed. As it turned out, taking productive farms and dividing them up into little tiny peasant plots totally destroyed any agricultural surplus that you may have had. Right. And so Mao increasingly, like Lenin, found himself in a position of having to resort to increasing authoritarian measures in order to retain control of the economy. Right. What you had to do or to retain control of the country, what you had to do is start shooting people in order to prevent a counter revolution. Right. And he did. And that was what he did. And so if you're an American historian, by the way, this also had huge consequences in America, because the Truman administration, like most Americans, thought that, of course, Chiang Kai-shek was going to win. He kept telling us he was going to win, right? I mean, like, if you ask the guy, he's like, going to win. And it's like, well, he said it. And so there's a huge kind of soul-searching debate in America about, like, who lost China? Like, why did we lose China? What happened? How were we so deluded? What was going on? There's a great book about it by James Bradley called The China Myth. And of course, the Republicans used it as a weapon against Truman, right? I mean, here, you can't, McCarthy famously pointed out, you can't blame a Republican for the loss of China because a Republican hasn't been president since 1932. Right. So, I mean, like, this is Roosevelt, this is Truman, right? And so there was this. It is often said that foreign policy was a place where politics kind of stopped at America's shores, right? Foreign policy was bipartisan. China was the first time it blew back into politics because Republicans repeatedly accused the Truman administration of quote losing China, right? But anyway, what did Mao do? What Mao did was he purged. He started purging the country of people he thought were hostile, and this is very famous. It's called the anti-rightist campaign. And what Mao famously said was that they said, how are we going to run the country? What are we going to do? What are we going to say? And Mao said, let's have open discussion. He said, let us have 100 flowers bloom. Right. And it's a wonderful argument for intellectual diversity. Right. I mean, let people publish books, let people talk about whatever they want. Let's have a conversation. Right. In fact, Mao was full of shit. And whenever anybody quotes that let 100 flowers bloom, you got to add the caveat. That's not what Mao really meant. What Mao really wanted was for everybody to publish whatever they wanted and say whatever they wanted, so he could identify the people saying things he didn't like and have them shot, which is exactly what he did. And so, oh my God. Wow. Yeah. Was real. I'm not used to doing this with an earbud. Okay, is that fine? I didn't unplug it or anything? Okay.
My phone was fine, and then it went back to static.
Okay. All right. I guess if you can't.
Okay, I can hear you.
Okay. All right. So what is this? Is this StreamYard? Okay. All right. I got a ton of notifications. Okay, so anyway, the other thing we got to mention is Mao leads China into total economic collapse, right? And this is a two-pronged thing that we got to talk about called the Great Leap Forward and the famine. The Great Leap Forward is Mao's sort of cockamamie industrial scheme to increase economic production and economic productivity to Western industrial levels, right? And the fetish that communists have is for steel production. It's like apparently if you're a communist and you think, are we an industrialized country? The answer is, what's our steel production relative to the United States or Britain or Germany or whatever, right? And so Mao gets everybody in this campaign, we're going to increase steel production. Well, I mean, the way to do it, of course, is build power plants, build an electrical grid, build infrastructure, build, coal mines and iron mines and steel smelting factories, and then, factories to utilize steel or whatever. Instead, Mao's like, nah, fuck that. That's complicated. We're not doing this shit. We're revolutionary Chinese. Everything can be overcome through the application of willpower. So what we're going to do is everybody build a kiln in your backyard, okay? A backyard kiln. This is totally legit. I saw that you laughed. Your family's been shot. And so then what you're going to do?
You are my family. Congratulations.
Well, I'm a good communist, so obviously that's not true. And so then take all of the iron implements in your house, like your wok, your tools, your agricultural implements, your spade.
I'm putting my wok in the kiln.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, you've already been liquidated, so we don't have to worry about that.
I need that wok to cook food for my family.
Unfortunately, no, you don't, because Chairman Mao says we can use substitute woks. Yeah. Your family, our family, right? Your wok, our wok. Right. And this is what happens. I mean, like you're talking about like the tools that people need for sustenance, right? But they gather them all up and they throw them into the kiln and they smelt it into iron, and it mostly becomes pig iron, which is useless. It's not, it's brittle. It's yeah. And so as a consequence, what happens is agricultural productivity goes, people's ability to cook food, just nothing. And the country just kind of falls apart. Right. And there's a terrible, terrible, terrible famine that kills tens of millions of people. The worst man-made, the worst famine and the worst man-made famine in the history of the human race. Right, worse than the Bengal famine, worse than anything that has ever happened in Chinese history. Mao presides over the famine deaths of millions of people. Right, and we should mention it's only just really become documentable in Chinese history. There's a historian who teaches in Hong Kong, Frank Decatur. He's written a really good book about it, Mao's Great Famine. There is I don't remember his name, but there was a man in China who wrote a book about it called Tombstone. It was banned in China, but excerpts of it were translated after it was published in Hong Kong. I have a copy of it. And his father died in the famine, which is why he wrote about it, why he wanted to write about it. And so Mao evades all responsibility for this. What Mao does is he accepts a certain degree of collective responsibility and says, "Oh, I'll step back. I'll kind of back up and let everyone else run the country for me, and that'll be fine." And then Mao makes his comeback in the 60s. Right after a period of time, the famine is in the 50s. After a period of time in the 60s, where he's sort of in the hiding, I want to say it's like 1963 or 64. Mao sort of makes this comeback, and it's all started. I have a book about it, and it's this surreal thing. It started by a journal article in like an academic journal criticizing the collective leadership that's running the People's Republic of China. And this leads to this sort of surreal event in Chinese history called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, in which Mao, appealing directly to the masses of Chinese people, argues that China has kind of gone off course and we have to fix it. And the way to fix it is to embrace ultra radical Maoism, Maoist principles, super sort of ultra communist principles at the bottom level up. And anybody who doesn't do this is a right deviationist or a capitalist running dog and has to be eliminated. And so by sort of appealing to ordinary Chinese people, Mao creates this sort of intense cult of personality, sort of hysteria in China that leads to this sort of crazy kind of revolution in China. They cut off all contact with the outside world. All the foreigners leave. And they recall all their ambassadors from abroad. And basically, anybody who is not totally 100% Mao is killed or tortured or commit suicide or is politically purged. And people suffer like tremendously. What?
Purged.
Yeah, purged means,
I know what purged means.
it could mean a variety of things, but none of them are great. And so we should mention future communist leader Deng Xiaoping spent time in the countryside. He was sent to work with ordinary people to teach him about ordinary people, and so he would be less egotistical. You had to the current leader Xi Jinping, his father. Was sent out there, and he grew up in the countryside for a while when his father was being punished. When my advisor, we had to report when I was in grad school to the department about our progress on our degree, and my advisor always referred to them as Maoist self-criticism sessions. And they would have these meetings in China where you would go in and everybody would lead some chants. We're going to have some singing. We're going to read some of Mao's works in the Little Red Book, which everyone has a copy of. Does anyone not have a copy of the Little Red Book? Great, you've been shot because you were not insufficiently patriotic. By the way, do we need to publish other books? We have published the Little Red Book. What other book do we need? Great, I'm glad we all agree. And then what you would do is we would bring someone up and be like, are you a good communist? And you'd be like, yeah, I'm pretty good. And they'd be like, really? Really? That's what you think? And eventually you'd be up on stage crying, weeping hysterically because you're a bad communist. You'd be confessing all these sins, and you would beg them to punish you, and they would. And so, I mean, this kind of stuff happened all the time. The jet plane was a big torture they invented, where you take a person and you'd bend them over and you grab their head and pull it back as hard as you could, and you grab you put one hand on their shoulder and one hand on their wrist and push their arm up as high as you could. To dislocate their shoulder and hold them there for like hours at a time. And people committed suicide when they heard that they were going to be in trouble. People like entire legions of people were sent to the countryside or killed or whatever. And I mean, it was sort of surreal. They didn't publish books. They didn't make music or movies that were not totally communist. At one point, they toyed with changing the traffic lights because. Don't we all agree that red, the color of communism, is the progressive forward color? And thus, when the lights are red, it means you should go. And green, the color of American money, is the bad capitalist color. And that means you should stop because it's bad. And they did that for a while until it was like, oh, wait, that's a shit show. And they canceled it. Right? And Mao had this sort of unique gift for managing these crises. When the Great Leap Forward had turned bad, he deflected blame. When the famine had happened, it's collective responsibility. When the Cultural Revolution got out of hand, he seized control and sort of tamped it all down. And was sort of at each time, power kind of rebounded more onto him, right? And the most is that Olivia screaming? Olivia? I thought I heard Olivia yell. Might have been the cat.
I mean, Olivia's right there.
Are you all right? Did you just yell? Okay.
Playing in the office left classroom.
Carry on. And so politically, one of the things Mao would do, he loved swimming, and one of the things he would do, anytime the situation would get weird or whatever, he would jump in the Yangtze River and swim across it. And I mean, or the Yellow River. The Yellow River it's wide, it's got a fast current, and they'd be like, "Oh, Chairman Mao," and he would be like, "I can do it." And he would jump in the river and like swim away and demonstrate like his virility and whatever. And it would these sort of really weird kind of surreal political symbolism of him like doing this. And we should mention Mao lived like an emperor during this period. He lived until 1975. He got increasingly frail in the 70s, but up into the 60s, really from about the 50s onward, he lived in a series of incredibly luxurious homes. They each had private entrance and exits. They also had private railroads that would lead directly to them, so he wouldn't have to mix with the whole, the hoi polloi. He had his own food prepared, his own doctors. I think it was Liu Shaoqi, I think was a doctor. I have his doctor's memoir because his doctor wrote a tell-all book, I Was Mao's Doctor. And Mao also, by the way, spent a lot of time engaging in sexual relations with extremely young girls who were virgins, because there's a Chinese folk medicine belief that older men can regain their virility by engaging in sexual relations with extremely young virgins below the ages of like 14. And so, yeah, there was a steady stream of young women who would willingly do this because, I mean, Mao was Mao, right? I mean, he's the leader of the country, the great helmsman, as he was known in China, right? And so Mao apparently had a bed that was like a big 100-foot wide circular bed. And what he would do during the 60s is in the morning he would get up and he would just like scoot over to the right side of the bed, and there would be all the paperwork, and he would like do business, and like that would be where his office was for the day. And then at the end of the day, he would just scoot over to the other side of the bed, and then like that would be where he would sleep, and he just like lived on the bed. And so, by the way, Mao did not brush his teeth, so they turned black. Mao also did not like showers or baths. He liked to be rubbed with hot, wet towels. So
Who does it?
I mean, I like to be rubbed with hot wet towels, but also I shower as well. So like I might rub myself with
Ever
a.
been rubbed with hot, wet towel
You don't know what I've done.
to yourself?
I mean, it doesn't mean.
Yeah, Al was certainly not doing that to you.
No, he's got 13-year-old girls for that.
Gross.
But like I might enjoy like a hot towel wrap, but I'm not gonna like not shower, right? Like I mean, you might do that after you shower. Uh, but Mao lived this sort of sybaritic lifestyle where I mean he had the entire resources of the nation at his command, right? And for Westerners, China was like an unknown quantity. I mean, it was like nobody knew anything about what was going on. I mean, you couldn't just you couldn't go to China and like just walk around as like North Korea. And so, we should mention, by the way, that all this comes to an end in a way in 1975 when Nixon actually goes to China. Henry Kissinger, the dual Secretary of State National Security Advisor, brokers a deal whereby Nixon flies out to Asia, but instead of going wherever he was going, he diverts to China. And he has a personal meeting with Mao for several days. And it was often thought that a Democrat could never normalize relations with China because, of course, they would be accused of being a communist, right? No one's ever going to accuse Nixon of communism, whatever you think of him. And so it's sort of the saying is only Nixon could go to China, right? Only that kind of person could do that thing. And so, Mao was like, it was like 74, I think. Mao was like super old and like super out of it.
Nixon was already
No, I guess it was like 73 then. It was like when it was the last year Nixon was in office. And I mean, like Mao was already like basically decrepit. I mean, they like wheel him out, and Mao was like, and around for like a couple hours, and Nixon like talks symbolically. Nixon like shakes his hand and has a picture taken with him, and they talk through an interpreter. But Nixon is like, yeah, that guy's not running anything. I mean, like that guy's clearly is like a figurehead. And the number two.
72.
Okay, there you go, 72. And the guy who's really running China at the time is Zhao Enlai, who's Mao's number two. And actually, it was the next year wherein Zhou Enlai developed stomach cancer. And when he went to the doctors, they reported to Mao, and Mao told them not to tell him what the actual thing was and not to treat it. So he died in agony of stomach cancer because Mao was worried he would try to take over and like kick him out. And so also Lin Bao was the general who led the People's Liberation Army to victory in 1949. By the mid 50s, he'd become a problem. So he had a plane crash. Yeah. He had a plane crash. He was on a plane and it crashed. And everybody was like, man, that sucks. And I was like, I know, planes just crashed. That's so terrible. Man.
I've never heard the phrase "he had a plane crash."
Well, I mean, he had a plane crash is what happens when you put someone on a plane and then you fuck with the plane so it crashes. And then it crashes and you're like, oh, well, we'll pour one out for him.
Danny,
Like Danny.
the Iron Fist.
Iron Fist, Danny Rand.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, was Danny Rand? Yeah, I guess Danny Rand's plane did crash on purpose. Yeah, I don't remember much of that show because it was fucking boring.
We're not too
So anyway, Nixon opening relations with China was huge because not only did it open China to the West, but it created this sort of three-way break in the Cold War. Right now, it was no longer Russia plus China versus America.
I'm gonna cut you off in 10 minutes.
Okay, it was now sort of a three-way thing, and maybe China, who had a historical enmity to Russia, if Russia and America went to war, maybe China would just stay out, right? Which is, for our purposes, was definitely an improvement, right? And what it led to in China was a big deal because when Mao dies, they deify him. He's buried in a mausoleum in, I think, Tiananmen Square, where they have him preserved under glass, which is of course terribly creepy. Nobody goes to that shit anymore. Right. My favorite story is when they opened the first McDonald's in Red Square. The line in Red Square in Moscow to get to McDonald's wrapped all the way around Red Square, obscuring the mausoleum that has Lenin in it. And they were all like, "Oh, is this people?" Like journalists were like, "Is this the line for the mausoleum for Lenin?" And everybody's like, "We don't give a shit about that. We're here to get McDonald's, right? Like we're here for Big Macs."
Golden Arches.
And nobody gives a shit about Lenin. McDowell's, it's totally not the same. It's totally different. Yeah, the Golden Arch is totally not the same. And so, having said that, when it's every Japan, it's sexual chocolate. I made a joke about that in class one time, and everyone stared at me, and I was like, "Come on, guys, Coming to America," and they're all like, "No, I was like, it's a movie from the '80s." I'm like, "Oh, it's an old movie," and I was like, "Well,
So old.
You kids." It's when Eddie Murphy made movies good.
You're now teaching kids who didn't live through 9/11. So.
No, they don't even know. Yeah, they don't even know about 9/11. Shrek. I mean, Shrek was like what, 10 or 15 years ago?
No,
I mean,
longer than that.
yeah. What has he even done since then?
Who?
Eddie Murphy. Haunted Mansion.
No.
You know, that's about it. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, if you're Eddie Murphy, like you probably don't need. I mean, he had probably legal problems, but he's probably still got a pile of money.
He's got a spice roll.
Holy crow.
What?
I've got a dry skin patch here that I'm scratching and he's
The-
just vibrating.
He likes it. He likes it. I see him. I see him. So the trick is though, when Mao dies, even today, the Chinese communists deify him. They say the formula they use today is that he was 2/3 right, 1/3 wrong, which is an extraordinarily generous curve to grade him on, right? But leadership of the country passes through a couple of hands, but it is up in the early 80s in the hands of Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping, if you've ever played D&D, Deng Xiaoping looks like a gnome. Like he just this short, like little round-faced man who just looks like a gnome. But famously, Deng Xiaoping did two things that are important. He symbolically, and one real thing, symbolically, he went to America. And there's a horrible picture of him in like a 10-gallon hat at a rodeo or something, where this little like 5 foot tall guy, they give him a hat, and he just looks like a dipshit. But he was game. He was like, whatever, I'm having a good time. Game. Like he was game. Yeah, and it was sort of like a huge thing. I mean, the Chinese communist leader is not this weirdo alien from a foreign planet. He's like just this guy, you know. I mean, he's laughing at the rodeo clowns. I mean, like, you know, he's not a weirdo, right? And then he went to Shenzhen. He went to southern China on a big tour where he talked about opening up and diversifying the Chinese economy, which, of course, if you live through the last 10 years, is kind of the biggest story in the history of Earth, right? And supposedly, what Deng Xiaoping said to overturn decades of conformity to Maoist ideology is he says, you know, it does not matter if the cat is black or the cat is white. It only matters if the cat can catch mice. And everybody was like, oh. And of course, if you're Chinese, you would have understood that there's like layers upon layers of meaning. But what Deng is saying is it doesn't really matter if we're Maoist or not. It matters if the economy grows, right? It matters if we do shit that works. And as a result, there were special economic zones created in Shenzhen and Guangzhou, where the Chinese government basically allowed capitalism to develop in these limited areas. And when it became obvious that these areas were incredible booming centers of prosperity, they basically expanded the special economic zones until essentially China has embraced market capitalism at a moderate level all over the country, right? I mean, it's still heavily regulated by the state, more than in America. The CCP makes sure that nothing develops that they don't have a say in. But essentially, China has evolved like a state-directed capitalist economy, right? And Deng was the guy responsible for it. And you can understand why the average Chinese person made, you know, $1 a day when he took control of China. And by the 90s, when he died, the average Chinese person's income had doubled and doubled and doubled and doubled and doubled again, and continued to rise until now China is in economic size and purchasing power parity, the second biggest economy on the planet Earth, right? Something that can be kind of laid at his feet. And so China's got a lot of challenges. At some point, people had always argued that Chinese people would reject the authoritarian model of the Communist Party in favor of democracy. And this never happened. The Chinese government has always been able to sort of buy people off, say, you know, just don't worry about politics. We'll give you a good life. That may change, right? I mean, you know, they may have an economic crisis. They may have the economic crisis in 2010. They spent their way out of. We spent $700 billion on a stimulus package. They spent like $5 trillion, and it worked. But it couldn't work forever. There's only so many bridges you can build, right? There's only so many railroads you can build. There's only so much shit you can pay people to make, right? But at some point, pollution, corruption, something like that may cause a problem in China that the government can't readily solve. But at the same time, they're able to marshal nationalistic discontent to China's bad treatment in an incredibly effective way. They've weaponized this idea that China can't be treated badly, and of course how it has in the past, right? And so hanging over all of the conversations in China about any foreign country is the century of humiliation, right? When we complain about the basically concentration camps that China runs in Xinjiang province for the Uyghur minority today, what the Chinese really hear is Europeans trying to tell us how to do our shit again, which we won't take, right? We won't do it. And so, you know, the Chinese government has very effectively kind of weaponized that into a way to unify all Chinese people around the idea that, like, you know, Westerners shouldn't tell you what to do, right? And so Mao's legacy is sort of very complicated. He unified China. It's like Stalin in a way. You know, if you're a Chinese person, you say, well, I mean, you know, he was the guy that put China back together again after this 50-year period of distress and disruption. On the other hand, much like Stalin, you can be, he knocked Volpoy down. much like Stalin, you can say, you know, like at what cost? I mean, like what was the consequence of Mao doing this? The answer is, I mean, you know, a lot of people fucking died, right? I mean, it was horrible, right? And so it's debatable today to understand how communist are the Chinese really. I mean, are they authoritarian? Sure. Is the political model communist in the sense that there's a single party state and, you know, massive reduction of personal freedom? Absolutely. Are they economically very communist anymore? Not really. No. And so, you know, that's an unusual combination. Who will know? You know, who knows what will happen as a result? So, do you have questions?
No, no questions.
Okay. Cheers then.
Next week probably won't be here because Hanukkah.
It's Hanukkah.
So,
Olivia says, "See you guys after 2 weeks."
reiterate because I'm not mine.
Dara and Olivia both suggest that we will not be here next week. It's Hanukkah, but the week after next, we will be here again. So as always, appreciate people dropping in. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Thanks to our Patreon subscribers. And also drop in with a comment suggestion for a topic if you're interested, because we'd love to have ideas of what you want to hear about. All right. So thanks for being here.
See you in 2 weeks.
See you in 2 weeks.
Drinks.
Drinks.
Bye.